We left off right around here, looking at how did the flower evolve through the evolutionary time frame and what's going on with this. Most people think leaf tissue was the source of how that became modified to then become the flower. Some people say maybe it actually was the whole stem tissue and that the petals came from the leaf, so stem and leaves. So it depends on the expert you talk to, but I think the first bullet point that they're modified leaves is what most are thinking. But here they're showing a nice kind of gradual process of, first they had like if you look on the top, the male portion of the flower, the stamens that, they were just on the leaf. And it was very kind of modest. And then you can see that they're trying to show this shifting of the morphology and kind of the collection of the microsporangium tissue to have it more, tightly packaged together. And then you have the filament supporting it. And then with the female, the megasporangium tissue, started off pretty modest again. And then you slowly through evolutionary time see this morphological shift where you have a definite, what we now call the stigma, and then the style, and then the ovary. So kind of a nice image there showing the progression. So, okay, there's over 250,000 species of angiosperms. So lots of flower design out there. So obviously we're not going to get into huge detail on that, but do know the difference between perfect and imperfect. So if you have a plant that's showing a perfect flower, that means it has both male and female parts to it. On the other hand, an imperfect flower is just going to be a female flower, or it will be a male flower, but it won't be both. And the other term I want you to know is this, the inflorescence. That is if you have lots of flowers clustered together that make it look like a flower, to our eye. So those three ideas. So you're seeing, yeah, the sunflower. So you see also, more advanced. So when you have more fusion of parts, tubular, with bilateral symmetry, so you can look at a flower, and if you know the basics of, more ancient type design versus more advanced, you can get a good feel for that once you learn some of the basics. Here are some ideas of inflorescences. Now, I'm not going to ask you to know all the words on here, just know what an inflorescence is. If you have a field guide and are trying to identify plants when you're out hiking, this terminology will be important. But other than that, just know what an inflorescence. And I want to point out too that sometimes flowers aren't very showy. If you think about catkins that are eventually going to pop here on the trees, the angiosperm trees, they don't look like much, but they do the job for that particular plant species. So again, you can see inflorescences have a lot of different design types. I'm just going to focus in and give you a taste of the Orchidaceae and the Asteraceae because they're the largest two families. When you look at all the families of, the angiosperms. So with the Asteraceae, you tend to see this pattern when you look at the flower that you'll have so-called disc flowers or ray flowers. And so we're thinking here about inflorescences. And so the disc flowers are in the center of the flower, the ray flowers are on the periphery. And you can see if you examine the ray flower, they can be sterile, where they're just a showy part of the flower. Sometimes they're female. And if you ever get the chance to grow these in your garden and visit them every day, you can see that you'll get this kind of spirally maturing parts to the flower. And so you'll start to see the flower design that way. And then when the seeds start to form, you'll see kind of this spirally patterned growth and development and maturation. So the sunflower is a perfect example of a flower type that the Asteraceae species tend to exhibit. So let's look at that. So here you have the sunflower, Helianthus. And if, when you look at that, most people say, oh, look at the sunflower, and you say, a sunflower, which is totally, understandable. But when you really look at it, it's actually different morphologies of different flowers all coming together, closely clustered to create the look of one flower. So this is definitely passing the test of an inflorescence. And so you can see the disc flower center of the sunflower, and then the ray flower with the attached petal. And here they're showing that in this case, it's a female. The ray flowers are female. You don't see the male parts there. It's just the stigma and style and ovary. But with the disc flowers, you can see that you do have anthers there. You got to kind of look for them because they're fused.
So the seeds, they're like individual flowers?
Yeah, you'll have it. So when you look, so once this blooms and it's been pollinated, you tend to see this spiraling pattern to when the seeds will show up. And it's very noticeable when you start to see the seeds showing up. So just look for that if you grow sunflowers in your garden or on your patio. Here they've dissected it a little bit. So they kind of took a knife and cut longitudinally so you can see a little bit better the disc flowers and the ray flowers. So very interesting design. So that is one type of flower type. The Orchidaceae, believe it or not, this is the largest angiosperm family, which is easy for me to forget because we just don't have many orchids here. And so they don't hit you when you're out hiking around. In fact, it's a real treat to find an orchid around here when you're out hiking around. So it's interesting. But if you go to tropical areas, subtropical, and the Orchidaceae family are everywhere, which is amazing to me because their seeds are just incredibly small. Yeah, yeah. And that's what I mostly see around here are the pink lady slippers. But you have to be lucky to see them because I know of several patches of where I've seen them. And it's from year to year. It's very sporadic. Sometimes I see them, sometimes I don't. So it's a real treat. Yes. Yeah, my former grad student, Carrie. Yeah, she did work with why are the Ram's Head lady slippers so successful in out by Munising there when that Ram's Head lady slipper worldwide is endangered or extinct. And so we have as far as I know, the biggest population of Ram's Head lady slippers. And for some reason, they just love the Grand Sable Dunes area in Munising. So yes.
Every time I go to Laughing Whitefish Falls,
Yeah.
I've seen,
Oh, really? Like consistently?
yeah, it's like around the same.
Oh, nice. So there's something about that area where they're real happy. Around here, I see like the woods right between Weston Hall and Whitman, that patch of woods there. There's pink lady slippers in there, but it's very hit or miss. Like one year I counted a dozen, at least a dozen, and then since then I haven't seen them pop up again. So, but they're there. It just depends. I think a lot has to do with the mycorrhizal fungi, the health of those that are present, because they have to have the fungus, otherwise the seeds won't germinate. But anyways, this flower type is more advanced. When you look at it, it has fusion of lots of parts. So the male, the stamen part is fused to the style and stigma. So you have to look really closely. And then you have 3 petals, but you also have 3 sepals that are the same color, even though technically they're sepal tissue. So those are when the Yeah, I know. You have the flower bud, when it hasn't budded out yet, the sepals are covering over.
where sepals are,
The same
Like-
color, the-
like petals,
Yeah.
I can't put it.
Me neither. So obviously, I'm not gonna ask you about it, but you're right, and I'm blanking on it. So, but yeah, I'll show you a picture here. You have the true petals have like, they call them two wing petals, and then one that's more highly modified that they call a cup. And then, or lip, and then the three sepals just look like the petals behind it, so I'll show you that. More advanced because of the bilateral symmetry. Some of the orchids, because the seeds are so tiny, they have to, initially they're very saprophytic and they depend highly on the correct fungus.
Oh, is a pitcher plant considered like a flower? Or no?
No, those are modified leaves, yeah. But highly modified, to a very specific function, so, but you can find pitcher plants in flower and you'll definitely see, oh, there's the flower, once they actually, but it's hard to find them in flower. So that's the head-on view of an orchid. So this is a typical representation. So you can see the lip is very modified, and it's modified like that because of the pollinator that will be pollinating this species. And then the male and female parts tend to be fused together in the center. And then you have the sepals. There are 1, 2, and 3 sepals, and then these are the 2 wings. So it gives a nice symmetry to it. But, so this is like typical, like what we talk about with the orchid flower, but you have to appreciate orchid flowers can be very unique and special. So aren't those amazing? So, yeah. So I have it in the notes. So this one here, a duck orchid, don't they look like ducks in flight? And then the vampire, doesn't that kind of look like Dracula? The vampire orchid. These are the dove orchids. Isn't that amazing? Looks like a dove. That's just amazing. And the monkey orchid. The egret, I think this is the egret. And this one they just call the naked man orchid. I'll show you. And it has flowered in there twice, but you just missed it. You happened, yeah, but you would have noticed it. This is the chocolate orchid. And not only is it beautiful to look at, it actually smells like hot chocolate. It's lovely. So I bought one from a local flower shop in the spring. And of course, they sell it to you in bloom, right? And so it was like, I don't know, it was right before closing that day. I went and picked it up. So it was, I don't know, 6-ish, 7-ish, something like that before. I think they closed around 8. I brought it home and I got really indignant. I'm like, it doesn't smell like chocolate. They sold me a mutant, and I was getting really mad. And then the next morning, my alarm goes off and I'm like, it smells like chocolate. So I found out that it cycles. It only gives off the scent during the day, and then at night it stops doing it. So I'm glad I didn't call and complain, because I thought they had tricked me somehow. But so be aware of that. Sometimes orchids will give off a scent, either if they are pollinated by something that is moving around during the day, they give off the scent during the day. But other flowers, if they're pollinated by something at night, that's when they give off the scent. So just be aware of that. We'll talk more about that, but you can see a lot of different designs. This is the Phalaenopsis genus, which is typically sold to normal people because it's pretty easy to keep alive. and not kill. So this one is pretty tolerant to low humidity. So you see them even here in stores, even though our winters, you have pretty low humidity in most, apartments and
Sell
homes.
them right at Meyer.
Oh, yeah. Right now, especially, they have a lot of them. And the great thing about orchid flowers is that they'll maintain their bloom for months. Like I've had orchids in the same orchid plant in bloom for over 3 months. So you get this long lasting, beautiful flower. And some are scented and some are not. Yeah. So this is the chocolate orchid again, so you can see that quite impressive. I had to bring my chocolate orchid, by the way, to the greenhouse because my home, it was too dry. And chocolate orchids are a little fussier than the Phalaenopsis, so. But yeah, it's a thing. It's a big industry.
You extract like the chocolate, like making like stuff and like use that. Like,
Yeah, I don't know if anyone's tried that. Like an essential oil type thing. Yeah, right. I don't know. It's very strong. I mean, I don't have a big house, but still, from my closed bedroom door, and I had the orchid in the living room, I could smell it. So the only downside to that is it made me hungry all day. So, but it was a lovely smell. So, but you can see the flower designs. So this is getting at the idea that, flowers are, it's a marketing campaign. It's an advertising campaign for the pollinator. So we'll talk more about that. So, okay. So we're looking at what we were just seeing with the orchid was a more advanced type plant, but don't forget, we also have some currently living examples of more primitive plants out there. So for example, this is the water lily, which is part of the basal angiosperm, so more ancient. And you can see, lots of flower parts. We talked about that. Lots of flower parts, lots of petals, lots of male parts to the flower and female parts. They tend to be, that superior ovary, so they tend to be a little bit taller than more advanced. And so don't forget that we do have some of these out there too. So this plant, this Amberella, is really ancient. They didn't even come up with vessels yet on this. So this is a very ancient. So the vessel shift happened after this plant evolved. And then the magnolids, where we get black pepper from, they also, so that's the pepper plant on the right there, fig on the left. So they are still living, ancient examples of still, that they're still living and made it through to this point in time. But this is kind of looking at the general idea of, first you had the seed plants. So, but really that's the gymnosperms came first. Okay, so they were the first seed plants. And then the angiosperms came after that. So they're the most evolutionarily advanced. So this idea of, here's a nice table showing kind of the process here where the angiosperms are becoming dominant during this time, and they're linking it right to the pollination idea that you have this co-evolution of the angiosperms with their partner pollinators. And then the other thing I wanted to point out too, as far as all the crop plants, the angiosperm crop plants, just be aware that it's not like it just showed up in one part of the world. There's a lot of diversity on geographically where you find these plants started. And there's been a lot of debate over the years on this. So probably the one I'm of course most familiar with is potato plant. There was a lot of debate about where that plant evolved to exist first, and if it was only one part of the world or several parts. And right now, as far as I know, the general consensus is Peru. That Peru was the starting point for potatoes. in domestication and spread from there. So, and I think that potato documentary, they got at that as well. So, but again, you can see here worldwide that you have a lot of differences on where you find the crop domestication showing up. Wheat, of course, is a huge crop, and it is something that, you know, we want those flowers to form. We want the actual dry fruit, and we'll talk about that, that we use for bread and all kinds of other things. So rice, and they think 3 different times in evolutionary history it's been domesticated by humans. So that was on the left, that was the wild corn, teosinte, that we messed with in order to get our current corn through selective breeding over thousands of years. Yeah, it's still growing wild. Yeah. In fact, they're interested to go back to it because the problem with corn, at least I'm not a corn expert, but they didn't have the knowledge to know that when you breed for sweetness, you also breed out some of the plant's ability to defend itself. And so that is kind of a case study for, we need to be more thoughtful about this. Like, what happens if we try to manipulate it to make it more pleasing to the human so you get a higher profit in that regard, but on the other hand, it could be harder to raise, to grow, because you've made it weaker in other areas. So
Sweet corn kind of worth it.
what?
The sweet corn's kind of worth it though.
Oh, I know, super sweet. They have super sweet varieties, and yeah,
This is that fresh.
yeah, corn on the cob. That's like summertime.
Mhm.
So here, this is a really interesting diagram showing the wild mustard plant and how that's been manipulated through selective breeding to give all these different crops. Isn't that amazing? So you have, you know, cabbage and broccoli and kale, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, that's all from wild mustard. And it's just from humans messing around with it to give you these different plant species. So really interesting to think about. And when you eat broccoli, the broccoli, you're actually eating flowers. You're eating flowers. So some interesting ideas there. The grass family, I don't have time to get into. It has some interesting flower design, but I'm not going to get into it in huge detail. But you can clearly see there's a little bit more parts to it. The grasses, the current family name is called the Poaceae. That's the family name. It used to be called Gramineae. But we rely heavily on that family for food production. So the grass family, very, very important. And then don't forget, there can be some really tiny flowers. This is duckweed, I think. The world's smallest flower is the duckweed. So that's a like a sampling pin, you know, specimen pin. That's pierced the flower. So it's very, very tiny. Each leaf is less than 1 millimeter across, with the stamens protruding only about a 0.5 millimeter. So tiny, tiny, tiny. Yes.
Brushes are also.
Yes. Yes. So this last couple slides is more just for if you're curious. I'm not gonna yeah, so I've had students ask me a little bit more about orchids, and like in the 1800s, it was a thing to go hunting. If you were rich, you hired people to go hunt rare orchids and bring them back to your collection. And then you could boast that you have, you know, the biggest collection in
They
the
would
world.
also buy certain species and like they collect it and then try and eradicate the entire orchid.
So other
species. They
hunters-
burn forests down.
Yeah,
you
I
know,
believe
so
it.
They were so valuable.
It was like,
Poison areas
Yeah,
permanently.
it was like they were crazy about it. Yeah.
There's a book, Orchid Muse by Erin. At my former college. That talks. about-
Orchid Muse?
Orchid Muse.
Orchid Muse.
Yeah, and they talk a lot about,
Yeah, the history of this.
Yeah.
I bet it was a good read.
oh,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, there's a couple books out there like that. I'll have to check that one out because I've read some of the other ones too. And it just leaves you scratching your head that people go so crazy about this. But yeah.
go insane about flowers.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're way more.
Um, I think so. I mean, I think the number of species just keeps growing. I mean, people are still manic about orchids. A lot of people. I mean, they're just, I can understand it. You know, the more I get into orchids, I feel the pull of how crazy it can get, you know, and like I've refrained from going, there's a big orchid show, like in a huge like stadium down in Chicago, like these huge, you know, warehouse size rooms. And it's like, I don't even want to go there because I would, you know, my credit card, which credit card debt. So I'm like, I'm going to resist that for a while. So, but yeah, I can understand the lure. One of my former grad students, Scott, when he graduated from here, he went back to Minnesota and he was working in the Twin City areas. His first job was a greenhouse. He was like the assistant greenhouse manager. And did I tell you this story? This really rich person in the Twin Cities wanted blooming orchids in every single room of his mansion. And then when they, you know, stopped blooming, he'd send them all back to the greenhouse and say, okay, give me another set. You know, they made so much money off that one person. Yeah. And so he's telling me that. So people get really, you know, insistent and crazy about the orchids. So this is just, you know, they do, of course, decoration, but the vanilla is extracted from an orchid. That's the only orchid I'm aware of that we use for any kind of food application. Perfume, of course, though, that's something. And then the only thing, the Cattleya orchid can be used that way, but and the Cattleya genus in general, people say it's the most showy. So if you have any time this summer to hunt around a little bit, because the Phalaenopsis orchid is usually what's sold, you know, like in general stores, but if you go looking in flower shops, you'll see some interesting other species out there, but you have to really have the right conditions in your apartment or home to really support them, which I learned the hard way. My beautiful chocolate orchid I had to donate to the greenhouse. And then it took a while to recover because I didn't want to donate it. I wanted to hang on to it, but I just could not get it to work. So it was pretty sad when I donated it to the greenhouse, but at least it survived and it did flower at least twice since I donated it. Okay, so we've been talking about how you can look at a flower and at least get a general idea of some of the characteristics of the plant species. We did look at this in another set of slides with monocot and dicot. So do you remember which one might be the monocot example?
Is that one?
The right one.
Three.
Yeah, the three coming in threes like that. Multiples of 3 is a monocot. Multiples of 4 or 5 is a dicot. This one? Oh, this, the Brassicaceae? No. It doesn't say in the notes either. I don't know what flower that is.
I associate 4 petals with.
Yeah, yeah. And we've talked about this. But which one is ancient? More ancient. The one on the left. Lots of flower parts. It's tall. Ovaries right there. It's not superior ovary. Yeah. And then this, of course, you have a lot of fusion, bilateral symmetry, fewer parts. So just by looking at a flower, you can get a little bit of a feel. Okay, this one's tricky. This is really tricky. No, this is a flower, but so if you just looked at what's going on here, what would you say? Yes, I get that, right? Because lots of flower parts. The ovary trumps. Okay, so it's more important that you look at ovary position. That trumps how many flower parts. If you want to think of it that way. So this is more important that you have a sunken ovary. That is indicating a more advanced plant. But it's tricky, right? Because this part of it looks like it's ancient. But then this is, they dissect it away. and you can
Okay,
see
yeah,
it.
I was wondering that too.
Yeah, they dissected it,
Yeah.
so,
To show you the.
Yeah. so be careful about that. So with gymnosperms, we talked about how the pollen releases the cones and it's wind. Well, angiosperms can be, some of them can do that too, where there's a lot of wind causing the release. That's a very nice picture showing the grasses that you have some lovely pollen getting released. You can get spread of pollination over water. There are actually flowers designed to parts of the flower, the male part, to break off and float across the water like it's a little sailboat. I gotta figure out the name of that plant, but yeah, the male part of the flower will break off and float and hopefully bump into the female of the same species and pollinate. So you do have that. Gravity, of course, can play a role. And then, of course, we get into pollinators. So here they're showing that the male is given, oh, that's Vallisneria. Okay, I did find it. And so the pollinators, we're thinking about this idea that you have coevolution going on between the plant and the pollinator, where they are over time acting on each other as a selective force through the evolutionary process. And so we're going to get into that a little bit more, but you have to appreciate that not all pollinators look at a flower the way we do, the way our eyes and brain perceive it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And we need to also think about the other senses, not just vision. So we're going to talk about that as well. But when you think about it, it's usually a win-win situation with these pollinators and their plants, but not always. Plants can be a little ruthless sometimes. So we'll talk about that. But when you look at the pollinators that our crop plants depend on, a huge portion of that is honeybees. And that's of concern because of honeybee colony collapse disorder, which we'll talk about. So catkins, believe it or not, are flowers. So when you look up high this spring and see some of our trees with those catkins, those are the male flowers. Okay, so these will, if you see the wind, getting them to dangle and move, they will release pollen. The female, it almost looks like a cone, right? So a what? I believe so, yeah. So they're very, so think about it. If you are an alder tree and you're wind pollinated, you're not gonna waste a lot of your resources and energy making flowers if it's wind, because you don't have to attract wind, it just happens. So it's like, I'm not gonna waste my resources, so I'll just design so that my pollen can fluff up into the wind and carry on the current of the wind. And so you don't have to be showy if it's through some kind of environmental force like that is getting your pollen distributed. On the other hand, if you are relying on another organism, then the evolutionary process, you will have this force of the pollinator influencing how you design, if you're the plant, how you design your flowers to attract that particular pollinator. And then over time, as you can see this process co-evolving. It's really fascinating to watch this process. And they're seeing now with climate change that there has been some shifting in flower design, which shifts what pollinators are coming due to some of the impacts. So most of the time it's a win-win where the pollinator gets either maybe some nectar, they can eat some of the pollen, or some other benefit. We'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, the plant is getting pollination to occur, which is the transfer of pollen to the stigma, is the idea. So now you also have to factor in, okay, is it a perfect flower where all the male and female parts are right there, or do we have imperfect flowers? So let's think about that. And there's some terminology to think about. So we've already had this terminology, monoecious, but when you're in the angiosperm realm, when someone says that's a monoecious flower, what they mean, or monoecious species, I should say, what they mean is that you have one house of imperfect flowers. Which means you have one plant that has male flowers and it has female flowers on one plant, okay? So monoecious means that plant is carrying both male and female flowers on that individual plant that you're looking at. Now, because of that, they could self-pollinate, but usually the design mechanisms where that's prevented. And they tend to end up cross-pollinating. So a nearby plant that's also monoecious, the pollen from that plant will come over to the female plant on the other plant. So cross-pollination. Dioecious means that you have separate male plants and female plants of that species, all right? And so, of course, because they're just unisexual, they're just female or they're just male, they can't self-pollinate, they have to cross-pollinate. So that really, if you're dioecious, that forces the idea that you're gonna get pollen from another, nearby plant. Cross-pollination, and you also hear that term, just be aware. It means the same thing as outbreeding. And then self-pollination means the same thing as inbreeding. We, in the botany realm, we tend to say cross-pollination and self-pollination. I think in other disciplines, you might see outbreeding, inbreeding, but it means the same thing. Okay, so please, I've seen mistakes before on the final exam when we get into the angiosperm world, what monoecious and dioecious. So please spend some time nailing that down. So you can not get confused on that. Okay, so imperfect flowers, that means they're either male or female. So the females on the left, those are one. Whoops, big stigmas. Whoops, what happened? Come on. So the female, and then here you can see the anther is up on the filaments here. Believe it, stamen. These are the pistils. Believe it or not, corn. If you've ever walked through a cornfield, they're one house. They have the tassels are the male, and they're up top, and then the female is actually the corn on the cob that you eat was the female flower.
Oh, I have a question. So when you're like doing feed corn, you need to pull the tassels,
Yeah,
correct, so
yeah.
that they don't flower.
Yeah.
My family's from Iowa, so like my whole family detasseled probably for like 15 years, if not more.
Yep.
So I never
Eat.
really why.
Well, they do that so to allow for cross-pollination too. They're doing that too. And so, yeah, I mean, people get hired just to detassel, Yeah, you were sent out into the field. Go detassel.
Bummer. Like $1,500 for like 8 weeks and just plucking the tassels of the corn.
Not bad. Yeah. So I don't know. I liked walking through cornfields. When I was a postdoc, we grew corn in rotation with potato, and then we got to keep all the corn we could pick. It was, free corn. So I learned a lot about corn that year. That was really fun.
Oh, yeah.
So when you look at corn flowers, it's the female is an inflorescence. Okay. So these are all stigma and styles, all the what do you call that? What's that called? What do we call this? The husk.
I
Silk.
saw the
Silk. So people say the silk, right? They call this the silk, but that's really the stigma style. And if you carefully shuck the corn, and at this stage, you would see that each of those pieces, each silk, which is the stigma and style, leads to one area on the cob. And then if that, so pollen lands here on the silk and delivers the sperm, it'll develop into a kernel that you eat. So every kernel that you're eating was once an individual flower, female flower, Have you ever noticed that corn on the cob, there's some pieces missing, like there's no kernel there? It's because it didn't get pollinated. That's why you see blank spots. But you're eating the female flower inflorescence that did get pollinated. And it's really, we call it corn kernels. It's really a dry fruit. Weird to think about, but it's a dry fruit. Yeah.
Are they pollinated? By wind? From the line pollen?
A lot of it's wind.
So that's why they're in.
Yeah. I don't know if there is a dedicated pollinator for corn. I assumed it was always wind.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
We had a ton of corn back home. It must be in summer.
Yes.
Is corn like a starchy, like?
Yeah.
Food? So are the kernels themselves, like, are they like starch shoulder? Thing?
Yeah. It's so when you, yeah, it's essentially you're eating mostly, you know, yeah, essentially, yeah, you're eating the endosperm type portion. That's what, you know, that's the part we like. That has become, now it's super sweet. So, but you know, you can see here dioecious, so two separate houses. The left is showing the female plant of box elder, and on the right is the male plant of the box elder. So dioecious, two separate houses. So that's a good way to be promoting cross pollination or outbreeding. Be dioecious, have two separate plants for the male and the female. Or if you're perfect, monoecious, if you have a perfect flower, any of those conditions, you could stagger when things become mature. So get the pollen maturing when the stigma isn't done yet. And that's a strategy. They're still trying to figure out exactly how that works, but sometimes the stigma is curled shut, like not open for business when the pollen's getting released. And then eventually it'll open. I'll show you a picture of that. And then there's another category they just refer to as self-incompatibility, which means they're suspecting, in most cases, I see them hypothesizing it's a chemical block where the female part is, the stigma is producing some kind of chemical that the pollen does not do well with and won't go into, you know, pollen tube germination and sperm production. So there are strategies. So in, you know, many cases, it's desirable to outbreed. You want to cross-pollinate. Oh yeah, they're looking at pollen too. So there was a nice older study on stigma chemical makeup, but now they're turning their attention to pollen and saying, you know what, the pollen is also the exine of the pollen grain could have some play into whether or not it's going to be compatible. So here's an interesting picture. So I'm going to zoom in a little. So this is the stigma, but it's curled shut. It's like curled shut like a fist. So if I use my patience, how big this can get. So that's the stigma and style over you can't see. And then all of these here, these are the stamen. And you can see the pollen grains are shedding. So this is a perfect flower. And so this plant's like, you know what? I don't want to self-pollinate. This is not the best idea. So go ahead and get the pollen going, get it released. The stigma's going to stay non-receptive. It's curled up. And then, oops. Here on the right is after pollination. After the pollen's released, I should say. And then the stigma unfurls. So you go from a tight stigma where it's all curled up, not accessible, to wide open. After the pollen in this flower has already been pretty much used up. So that's a good strategy. That's a pretty ingenious, simple strategy to keep from being self-pollinated. Okay. So this idea of, whether or not they're perfect flowers, imperfect flowers, and then, are they on the same plant? So then it would be monoecious if they're imperfect flowers on the same plant, or dioecious if they're imperfect flowers on a separate plant, separate individuals of that species. So you have to think about these ideas, and then looking at flower design, are they really, really simple? Then it's probably wind pollinated. Are they pretty ornate? Then you have to start thinking about pollinators. And then you have to think about, well, what kind of pollinator might be attracted to these types of more ornate flowers? So we're going to get into that next time and think about, so that now we really have to put our like advertising campaign hats on. Like if you were going to design an advertising campaign to attract a certain type of organism, what would you do? So that's what we're going to think about in the next session. Okay, so, but we'll stop there. And I don't know if this is really appropriate. Well, there, you can't plant flowers if you haven't bought any.
Uh,
I see, I think my hometown, greenhouse also did that one.
Yeah. I thought that was very clever.
That's what I do.
You can't plant flowers if you haven't bought any. You can't plant flowers yet because it's too cold.